glasses are really dirty. Hello, folks. It feels like it's been 100 years since I sat down to film something. It's actually only been like 2 weeks, but it's been a very busy 2 weeks. So, what am I doing today? I'm doing my wrap-up for what month? June. Doing my June wrap-up. How many books did I read? I have no idea. Yeah, I guess 13 and no DNFs. That's encouraging. Okay. Alright, let's start. So the first book that I read was a nonfiction arc that I got from NetGalley. This is My Body Is Not a Disability Request by Amy Kenny. This is I talked about this in my Meteor book freakout tag. I don't remember for what question. But this is a nonfiction from a disabled woman talking about ableism and disability justice, specifically towards a Christian audience. But it's also like an amazing ableism 101 kind of story. Let's see. Let me just read my notes because my brain is in full weekend mode, which is I don't want to do anything, including form coherent sentences. Let's see. So this is a great overview of ableism and disability justice with specific scriptural tie-ins as a faith-based argument towards building a more inclusive church experience. So she does talk about Christian church community specific ableism, people coming up and being I'm gonna pray for you to be healed, talking about a disabled body as a form of punishment for sin. At the end of each chapter she'll have a list of top 10 most condescending prayer requests I've ever received, or top 10 or most common things people see when they see me, a young person in a wheelchair. And then also she'll have reflection questions. This would be an amazing book club book because she's got these very specific guiding questions at the end of each chapter. But it's also interesting to see her examine some specific scriptural passages and make the argument that the Christian God is actually a disabled God. A phrase in here that I think definitely transcends beyond this audience of the distinction between being healed and being cured. And there's a lot of people's expectations that you're going to be cured, your symptoms are going to disappear, and that's different than being healed. Healed is kind of you have you experience acceptance, you experience wholeness, you experience joy, those things can happen without your disability going away. And I think that's a really valuable distinction. Anyway, I thought this was really good. I think it's definitely very much for a specific audience, but it comparing it to other disability justice nonfiction that I've read, it stands up. It holds up to all of the other, it holds up to what are the other ones? I'm looking at my shelf over here. It holds up to the kind of conversations that you have in care work or Fearlessly Different, or where is Disability Visibility? I have a copy of that. There it is. Not me just getting distracted looking at my books. That never happens. Never. Mm-mm. Anyway, it was good and a bit of a surprise because I don't think I'd heard anyone else read it and talk about it yet. Okay, moving on. Next book was the audiobook for White Knight, which is book number 9 in the Dresden Files series by Jim Butcher, narrated by James Marsters. What happens in this one? I don't know. Let's see my notes. Harry gets real dark. We get some justification for why his persona is getting like very dark, but like people are starting to notice, and in like a very like people are getting unsettled, and it's not just like he's super powerful and don't get in his way, don't piss him off. This is more of like a something's off with you all the time. Man, all of these plot lines are starting to run together, and also like the past 2 weeks have just kind of like wiped my brain of things that came before. I felt like this one did have some like unnecessary objectification of women's bodies, especially Molly, because she's only like 18, 19. Like, I say like it's not gross, but it's still uncomfortable. And yeah, I'm remembering that scene, and it's like, yeah, given Molly's magical talents and like psychic talents, I don't know how you could have done that scene without what happens to her. But it's also like, did you need to do it that way? Did you need to? I mean, I'm being very vague, but this is also like book 9, so I don't want to like go into too many details. Oh wait, let me finish reading my notes. I elaborate. I say like, one description of her attractiveness would have been enough. Save the sexy for the succubus, which I think we do have white court vampires. I think that's where the White Knight title comes in. And the white court vampires are essentially succubus. They don't suck your blood, they suck your energy. And it's like, yeah, I think that's the thing that like tends to bother me, where it's like there are certain characters and scenarios where like these descriptions kind of make sense, but like there's other circumstances where like you don't need to keep reminding us how attractive this 19-year-old is. Like, just say it once. Like, I don't know. It's an ongoing thing with the series. It is highly imperfect. But I also put the note of like, there were some friendship moments with Karen that I really liked. I think this is like the point in the series where we really see Harry's relationship with Karen actually feel like a complex, full friendship, and we're not just being told that. So I like that. This book has a lot of political machinations. It's a lot more political than some of the other books, and I kind of found, I don't know so much like if it was like hard to follow because it was complicated. I think it was just like hard to follow because we're just explaining a lot of like political backstabbing, manipulative things, and that's not really what I come to these books for. I come to these books for a plot line where I don't actually have to pay attention that much, so I think I was just a little bit like, I know we're setting up some important plot stuff, but it's less interesting action and interesting magic and more just setting all the pieces up. I have a note about like gay and trans stereotypes. I do know like there's a moment where Harry leans into gay stereotypes to kind of like gain access to his brother's apartment, and I wish I copied it. There is a great line in there about like how he intentionally uses like the security officer's bigotry to his advantage and like does call that out, but you are still kind of like the first time you kind of like really portray like queerness or the attempt of queerness, and you're very much leaning into stereotypes, and that's just kind of like, I'm not impressed. And then there was something else with a character that I don't think that they are trans, but I do think this character parallels some very damaging stereotypes about trans women being men who dress up as women in order to gain access to women to harm them. I don't think we ever actually have the argument that this character is trans or identifies as trans or is but it's again, it's like clearly your concept of this kind of person is based on stereotypes. It feels weird. I think I'm gathering from like the notes I took that this is one of my least favorite in the series I've seen so far. Like, I think, like, the writing and, like, the setting up future plot points is good, but there's, like, throwing in of some other, like, new things. It's like, you didn't stick that landing. Okay, so the next couple books I'll mention, I won't go into too much detail because I had a reading vlog. That is, Miss Meteor. Oops. Excuse me. So that is Miss Meteor by Taylor K. Mejia and Anne-Marie McLemore. Small Favor, which is book number 10 in the Dresden Files series, and then To Hold the Bridge by Garth, which is a collection of short stories. The first one, which features a short story that takes place in his Old Kingdom series. So I'm going to start with To Hold the Bridge, because that's what's first in my notes. This was fine. I kind of go into it in more detail in the vlog, but it's, in summary, it's like, I mean, Garth has always been more about, like, his creatures, his magic systems, building his fantasy worlds, and I don't go to him for, like, character developments or really complex themes, and I feel like that's true throughout all of his short stories. I do want to mention something I forgot to mention in the vlog, which he has one story that I think, like, takes place, like, in a group of military people, and I don't know if it's, like, the 80s or something, and they use a racial slur against Chinese people, which bothered me. Like, the word is, like, time period appropriate, representative of the time period and the group of characters we're following, but it still made me very uncomfortable because he writes for younger readers. He writes for, like, middle grade and YA audiences, and it just felt very uncomfortable to, like, have that racial slur, knowing, like, that you are writing towards an impressionable audience, and then having, like, no challenging of that word and, like, no context. Like, no context about, like, this is a very bad word, please do not repeat it outside, like, this is not a word that you read and then you go and repeat in your life. And it just felt weird. It was just one of those things where it was like, why? This doesn't need to be in here. The more that I'm going in and, like, reading some of Garth Nix's stuff, it's like, I used to always say, like, he was one of my favorite authors. I'm like, no. He's written one of my favorite series. But he has definitely fallen down the list of favorite authors, just the more that I've gone back and I've, like, reread and gone into reading some of his other stuff. Oh, what my favorite short story in here was A Handful of Ashes. I would read a full-length novel of that one. Like, I don't think he would ever see this, but if anyone's ever looking for feedback of, like, what was, like, the strongest world that he described in here, like, A Handful of Ashes is, like, that, of everything in this book, like, that is the short story I might seek out to reread specifically. Anyway, there's that. Okay, next, Miss Meteor by Taylor K. Mejia and Anne-Marie McLemore. This might make it. This is probably currently in, like, my top 10 reads of the year. And I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook was very well done. This was lovely. I gush about it so much in that vlog. This is a mostly contemporary fiction with some very clear fantastic elements. I wouldn't call it, like, a full-on fantasy, but it's got some beautiful conversations about queerness and being, like, queerness and being societally non-conforming and being at the intersection of, like, multiple identities, you know, being, like, queer and brown in a small town that, like, wants to think that it's tolerant, but, you know, it has its limits, and also, like, teenagers coming into their own, becoming confident in who they are, even if who they are doesn't fit into the boxes that have been set out for them. It's lovely. It's an underdog story. It follows Miss Meteor, which is a kind of like a beauty pageant kind of competition. And we've got like friends who had a falling out, kind of re-examining and repairing their friendship, which is also lovely. I was saying, like, it kind of gave me Felix Ever After vibes in terms of, like, it being, like, this emotional roller coaster where you are just, like, you're just cheering on these young people and you're just, like, living vicariously through them. It's lovely. Hurrah! What was the other one? Oh, Small Favor. Did I take any notes about that? Only one. I wrote, is this the first time we don't have a I guess I'm a chauvinist pig, so sue me speech? Because that's like a character quirk of Harry Dresden, is he always has a moment, sometimes multiple moments, where he's like, listen, I know that I'm like a red-blooded straight man. If that makes me a chauvinist pig, I guess I'm a chauvinist. Like, this kind of like acknowledging his like misogyny flaws, but like just trying to argue that it's like part of his character. And it's like, it's one thing if you do that like in the first book, but like at this point it's like the author just like, you're just making it very clear that this is not a part of the character that you're interested in changing, and like, okay, we're done, we don't need to hear about it anymore. And I think in this book it's like, oh, we didn't have that conversation. That doesn't mean that Harry doesn't have those moments. I think he does. He has like a similar conversation where it's like, the best way to piss me off is to go after someone I perceive as vulnerable. Usually it's women and children. In this one, it's specifically children. So he has the conversation of like, you targeted a child, therefore I'm going to send you to hell kind of thing. I'm not going to go into it more because I do talk about it a bit in that vlog. I liked it better than White Knight. It's clear. And I think I mentioned that the next book, book 11, is the last book that I have read before. So I've got one more book and then I'm caught up with where I stopped reading 10 years ago or whatever. So I am quite curious to see where the story goes because it is all new from here on out. Cool. Okay, the next book I finished was the audiobook of Anne of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery. I enjoyed it. I definitely see that the charm that you find in the first book, Anne of Green Gables, like definitely continues. Anne is older. I think she's like 16 to 18 in this book. She is a primary school teacher. And she and her foster mother, not really mother, but like the woman who raised her when she came in Anne of Green Gables, they now take in a pair of twins who are like age 4 and 5. And the boy definitely has a lot of echoes of young Anne, of being constantly getting into mischief, very impulsive, very inquisitive, and you definitely see how Anne's personality is really like the right person to guide him to, you know, it's about like getting this like little boy to be good, but just being like making sure that like, if you're gonna be mischievous, don't do it in a way that hurts other people. Like if you're going to, you know, rough house, can you do it in a way that doesn't like damage objects around you, which is like, you know, not necessarily trying to like beat the child out of him, but like teaching a child to be aware of how their actions impact people around them, and being able to think about like, you know, making other people happy can make you happy. Anyway, there's a lot in here about like, and also like with Anne being a teacher, like you there's a lot in here about like the nature of children and their imagination, and their being impulsive, and how like the nature of growing up, and it's very sweet. So I said with this series, this was an amnesia read for me. I had put Anne of Green Gables on that list, even though that was the book on that TBR that I had remembered the most. And I was basically reading through, I've got the little box set of the first 3 books. And I was reading through them to be like, do I actually have any kind of feels towards them? Do I want to keep them? And yeah, I think, you know, and I'll probably get around to reading book 3. I don't think I would continue much more in the series. I mean, now it's kind of like historical fiction. It wasn't necessarily historical fiction at the time, right? Let's see, this was written in 1909? I mean, for something that old, it is very... for a classic like that, it's very accessible. The language is very accessible. But it's not like the genre and the emotional range that I'm really drawn to. I'm happy to like finish out the ones I own. Beyond that, my feelings are like, I see the hype and that's great for you. What next? Oh. The next book I finished was another arc from NetGalley. This is The Final Strife by Saara El-Arifi. One of my top reads of the year. I'm starting to see people finally getting around to reading their arcs, because I think like it was just published a little while ago. I'm finally seeing people like come out, actually get around to reading it, or like picking it up and talking about being excited about it and give their reviews out. This is a very, very strong debut. Let's see, this is an adult fantasy that follows 3 young women who are each from a different social caste in this society. The leadership caste have red blood, and their red blood allows them to cast magic. The middle caste has blue blood, and they are the kind of drudgery working class. And then the ghostlings have clear blood, and they are the kind of invisible slave caste. And this is definitely what makes it like an adult fantasy. The ghostings in past times tried to lead this social rebellion, and it failed. And as punishment, now going forward, anytime a ghosting is born, as an infant, they have their hands cut off and their tongue removed. So that's horrific. But then what happens in this book is now we have this cast of forcibly physically disabled people who have formed this very adapted, complex society. Like they have developed this very... they have developed this physical sign language that uses like their entire body. And because they are the invisible slave caste, most people haven't bothered to learn it. Therefore, you now have a subjugated class who speak a language that nobody can understand. So they could talk about how to murder you in front of you and you would never know. And though they have no hands, they have now adapted tools so that they can still like carry things and use brooms and stuff, which it shows like I don't know how to like put this thought into a grammatically correct sentence, but there's something in there about like adaptive and accessibility, and in this world it is used so that they can still be productive. But like if you kind of translate that to our world, it's kind of more just like, hey, if you adapt things to meet people's needs, then hey, they can do the thing. That's such a clunky way of describing it. I'm so sorry. I think the point I'm trying to make is like we see that this class of people have been forcibly disabled as a way to make them lesser. But you see that like their value, their drive for life, their motivation, their ability to be whole human beings who have a control of their future is not determined by what their body looks like. And I think that even though it's told in this even though it's conveyed in this very like horrific way, like that is such a powerful message. And I'm just talking about like one facet of this whole story. oh my god, I if I really start talking about it, I will go on forever. It's fantastic. I'm going to get myself a physical copy, and then I need to reread it because I have seen a couple of comments about our character Anur, who is the one who is living in the Red Blood leadership cast. And she is a fat character, and some reviewers have pointed out that like the language talking about her being fat and in comparison to other characters is like not great. And that is just something that I clocked in that she was fat, and that's kind of like as much as I actually like tuned into. So I need to reread that and kind of like pay more attention to that specific language. Because I've seen some criticisms about that, but I think so far like that's like the only criticism consistent criticism I've seen about it. I have told you like 2% of what you need to know about the story. If you like complex adult fantasy, keep your eye out for reviews for this one, because this one is absolutely worth paying attention to. So next I read an ebook copy of Las Beauty Queens by Monalisa Ojeda, translated by Hannah Kauders. This is a book I won in a Goodreads giveaway a long time ago. This is a sort of memoir collection of vignettes by Monalisa, who is a trans Puerto Rican sex worker from New York City. Okay, drawing from his/her. So, he uses both pronouns interchangeably, I guess. Trans performer, sex worker, and undocumented immigrant. That's another aspect. So this is kind of like a memoir love letter to like a period of like the 90s through like the early 2000s of this community of queer, Latin, trans sex workers in New York City. I struggled with this because like I feel like each story is from like a different character's point of view, but we never really know. It never says like I am such and such person. They're all first person, but they do seem to be from different iconic people's point of view. I think they wrote each of these kind of memories from a first person point of view, but the story may not necessarily focus on the same person each time. And these are stories about drug addiction, about getting arrested, about like going to funerals, about like getting like a sense of community, a sense of alienation, and it is, you know, like this surprised me. I read it like within like 3 or 4 hours. It was very, very quick read, and I think like it's just best described as like a snapshot into this very particular community in a very particular time and place. And I found it like, okay, like having it now that it's been several weeks since I read it, it's not something that's like gonna stick with me too much, but I do feel like it's, if you're somebody who likes memoirs about something specific like that, I think it's a good one. I think it does give the reader a spectrum of the kinds of experiences and the kinds of personalities that these people experience and maybe are still experiencing. One thing to note is they do use some language around trans people that is kind of outdated, but they make it very clear that this is the language they were using for themselves at the time, and these were the definitions of transness and queerness that they had for themselves at the time. I think there are instances where you hear like these characters experience racial slurs, but for the most part, I think the most common use of some of these outdated terms is not used in a derogatory way. It's just used in the way that this is how they talked about themselves at the time. So that I think that's worth giving a heads up. Yeah, I'm glad I read it, but I also feel like it it didn't like blow me out of the water. Anyway, so yeah, it didn't like completely blow me away, but I'm glad I read it. It was interesting. Next thing, I listened to the audiobook of Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity by Devon Price, Ph.D., and this was narrated by the author. Devon Price is also the author of Laziness Does Not Exist, which is another one of my favorite nonfiction that I read last year, and Unmasking Autism is probably going to be one of my favorite nonfiction of this year. So Devon Price is a queer, trans, autistic psychology professor. I think a professor of multiple things, but definitely they have like a psychology background. And this book does focus on like autism and specifically talking about like the concept of masking, which is a neurodivergent person trying to hide or lessen or change some of their very visible behaviors to not make it so apparent that they are disabled or that they are neurodivergent. It talks about kind of like what are the various ways that masking, what it looks like, what are the reasons that people do it, like what are the reasons, like what are the various ways that people choose to mask or choose to start unmasking and kind of like not self-police their own behavior and language so much. What are the driving factors for some people to mask more than others? What are some things that like are very hard to mask? And within all of that, or like externally of all of that, Devon also kind of does talk about how autism has such a broad spectrum of behaviors and symptoms, for lack of a better word, and ways of describing what that experience is, that it's very hard to have like a clinical diagnosis for it. But they do kind of say, this comes back to, I wish I had a copy of it or I had actually written down what they said, but it's about autism is it is a way of how a brain and body processes information and then like responds to it. Anyway, I don't know if my description actually does their description any justice. Let's see what the notes I took. Like it does define a universal description of autism, but it emphasizes the broad spectrum of traits and how some of those traits could be contradictory. Like someone who is autistic and nonverbal versus someone who is autistic and like talks constantly about their special interest. Somebody who doesn't like to be touched versus somebody who really, someone who is like doesn't like to be touched and is sensory avoidant versus someone who really likes tactile involvement and is sensory seeking. And kind of talking about like what is the thing in common that drives both of those behaviors. Let's see, they talk about like the pros and cons of pursuing an official diagnosis and like the various challenges to being able to do that. They talk about the history of early autism research and how white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, etc., how those things are involved in that history and has kind of, all of them have contributed to this concept of masking and the need for various people to mask in order to be safe or to access the things that they need. It's amazing. Like, I had the same thought about their other book, Laziness Does Not Exist, and like this is not a very long book. The language is very accessible. The personal anecdotes of people they interviewed or like their own stories like are very easy to follow, but they pack so much information in there and so much like social norm challenging information in there. I highly recommend looking into their books. I also follow them on Instagram specifically, seeing how like they engage in the world and how they challenge the world and challenge a lot of social norms. Like it's I love the conversations that they have, and I feel like I walk away from their work more prepared to go into the world and meet people where they are at, instead of always like holding an unfair expectation for the people around me. I think they are doing great work, and I know that they are currently writing another book, which I will be reading, whatever it's about, whenever it comes out. I look at their future literature career with great interest. Okay. Talked about that. Okay. Alright, so the next 3 books I also talked about in another vlog. Let's see, this vlog, I titled this one, like, Making a Quiche While Talking About Cults. So, here we go. So we've got Terciel and Eleanor. This one does not really have a cult. This is Terciel and Eleanor by Garth Nix. And then I've got Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. And then I finish it off with Sorrowland by River Solomon. Alright, so again, like I'm gonna try to keep my discussions of these fairly short because I talk about them more at length in the vlog. So Terciel and Eleanor, this is the newest published book in the Old Kingdom series. The first book in that series is Sabriel. This is this, and then books 2 and 3, Leora and the Borson, are probably some of my favorite fantasy books of all time. So this one is a prequel. This one follows Terciel and Eleanor, who are Sabriel's parents. So we learn about we learn about Terciel as a young Aborson in training, and then Eleanor as a young woman who realizes that she has charter magic and learns about this whole neglected part of her heritage. So for context, in this world, the Aborson is a magical lineage of a counter necromancer. So in this world we have magic, and you have like dead creatures and free magic creatures and necromancers who kind of raise the dead and play with free magic, which is kind of like entropic magic. And then you have an Aborson who mostly uses charter magic, which is like kind of like organized life-giving magic. And they are tasked with, you know, fighting necromancers, putting the dead down, fighting free magic creatures, and kind of like keeping balance in this world. My hope for this when I read it was it would be better than the book Golden Hand, which is the book that was published before this one. I really didn't like that one. So my standards were my hope for this book was very modest. I do think it is better than Golden Hand, and it was okay. I talk about it more in that vlog, but I definitely feel like the core 3 of that trilogy, Sabriel, Libra, and Aborson, are very strong, and then like the rest of the stories added to the rest of the series are just kind of like my main critique with this one is like we don't have anything new. We don't have anything new to this world. We are literally fighting adversaries that we have seen in other books. We don't see the magic used in any way that it hasn't been used before. Like, okay, we figure out how like Sabriel's parents meet, but like nothing gets expanded. So that's like my biggest critique of this book. Like I still kind of love the world and like the series as a whole, but you know, if Garth Nix did not write any more Old Kingdom books in the future, I think I'd be okay. Because I don't think he's doing it. I think he does it because the fans want more, not necessarily because he has like a fascinating story burning inside him. Anyway, okay, enough of that. And then I listened to the audiobook of Cultish. Who is the narrator for that? I didn't write that down. I will find out who that narrator is and put it in the description box. I have titles, authors, translators and narrators, all of that will be listed in the description box of this video. So this is a nonfiction that is exactly what it says. It talks about the language of fanaticism, the language of cults and cult-ish things. So it talks about things like, you know, Jonestown, all the way to the concept of like cult beauty products or like cult horror films. It talks about like MLMs. It talks about CrossFit. It talks about Alcoholics Anonymous, to varying degrees of severity. And kind of like what I said in my vlog, it's kind of like surface level. It's like very accessible. It's a very accessible nonfiction. And it does kind of like, I guess, kind of address the question of like what's like the definition of a cult, and like what is it about cults that draws people in. But it kind of really only talks about like the language side of it. Like it touches a little bit like on the psychology and like time and place, you know, being in the right place and right time. But it's really just focusing on the language, which is like, yeah, there's a full book of stuff to talk about there. But it's, you know, like this was like a comfortable like 4 stars, not a 5-star nonfiction read. Just because like I didn't feel like it was kind of like cracking open my world in terms of like understanding human nature or understanding like social structures or something. It just kind of like gave me some references and examples and language to talk about why do some people get drawn into a conversation and other people are like, no, that's a whole bunch of red flags. How could you fall for that? Like I do recommend it. And I feel like this would be like a great like nonfiction for people who don't for people who like don't usually read nonfiction. Again, like just the way it's written is like very accessible. Yeah. Okay, and then like, which leads into, but of course like this book pairs really well with Sorrowland because this is about a woman who is trying to escape a cult. Sorrowland follows 15-year-old Vern, who, she's 15 and she has just escaped a, cult compound, called Cainland, Children of Cain, and she has given birth to twins in the forest. Vern is albino, one of her children is albino and the other one is not, and she lives in the forest in hiding, and then weird things start to happen. This is a gothic horror. I kind of talk about a lot of like what happens in that vlog, but it is kind of about like the horrific things that let's see, there's a quote in here on the back from Roxane Gay that I think does kind of summarize the thematic story arc of this book. This country has a dark history of what it's willing to do to black bodies, and River Solomon lays that truth bare in a most expected, absolutely brilliant way. Very true. I started off saying that, like, Vern uses she, her pronouns, but there's a great conversation in here. There's multiple conversations in here about, like, not really fitting into strict gender roles, but I really liked, like, this particular take about it. I'm in between, said Vern quietly, looking away shyly. Gogo reached for Vern's chin and turned her face to her. It's okay, she assured. There's a word for that, you know, in English. I'd rather not know it then, said Vern. Gogo nodded. Why not? Because without a name for it, it's just something I am, a part of life. Once it's got a name, I know that means somebody has studied it, dissected it, pulled it apart. When something has a name, they can say it's bad, said Vern. And she didn't want to hear anybody else's thoughts on what was bad anymore. And they talk about that a little bit in the vlog, how I really like that take on, like, trans and non-binariness, like, adding another layer of, like, what it looks like and what it doesn't have to look like. Like, you can still use, like, you know, she, her, or he, him pronouns. You but can still like identify as like trans or non-binary or whatever way you want to describe it or not describe it, and like that feeling is valid. And I you know, while there is so much power in being able to like put a name to something and be like out and proud about it, I think there is also a very empowering conversation in like having that be something that is yours and is not like other people's business. So that's a very like small aspect of this, not very small. It's a one of the smaller aspects of the story, but it's just a particular it's not a conversation that I don't think it's a conversation that I have found in a novel yet, and it's not one that is very common, but I like it. But yeah, it's atmospheric and moody and unsettling and haunting and very queer and very fuck white supremacy, fuck the patriarchy, fuck gender norms. I think this is now cemented River Solomon as maybe one of my favorite authors. I also read their book, The Deep, and that one is a book that lives rent-free in my head, to use that phrase that all them kids are using these days. And I really need to get a copy of An Unkindness of Ghosts, and I look forward to their literary future with great interest, because I think they are doing some very fascinating things in the world of writing and storytelling. So, hurrah. Okay, what's next? We're almost done. Okay, the last book I read this month when things got super busy and I had very little brain cells left over to rub together, I read Priest by Sierra Simone. This is an erotic romance. Sierra Simone, I think, is probably most known for her Thornchapel series, but Priest follows a priest, a young hot priest, as he kind of has a crisis of, not so much a crisis of faith, but a crisis of life direction in his calling as a priest when he meets a young woman. Part of what drove him to become a priest is his sister, when she was like 15 or 16, she committed suicide because she was sexually abused by their local parish priest. How does that drive him to become a priest? I think he kind of feels this calling of trying to repair the parish's relationship with the church and kind of work from the inside to fight against that kind of secrecy and harm that led to the abuse and death of his sister. And we definitely see that, like, not everyone in his family feels the same way. Everyone is grieving in very different ways. What I love about Sierra Simone's work is her books are very dark, but they really, like, kind of crack open the dark recesses of human emotion, and also of human emotion and desire and drive, and like what drives human beings in their most like base impulses, and then also how that rubs up against concepts like religion and ritual and like what is considered sacred, what is considered holy, what is considered sacrilege. That's something that's very heavily explored in the Thornchapel series as well, and I think she does some really, really interesting things in this book too. And yes, some of them are just like kinky, sexy sacrilege stuff, but I do think she also asks some interesting questions about that I do think kind of challenge purity culture in Christian theology, and like, yeah, like how do we like this, like human physical intimacy is supposed to be this like utmost expression of like love and promise and commitment, and how can that be at odds with the concept of like sacred and holy? And I think she wrestles with those questions in her characters in a way that I find very fascinating. I did kind of like have a problem with the like last act resolution where I wasn't super on board with our female love interest. I forget her name. I'm sorry. Her reasoning for why she does what she does, like when she does kind of explain it, I'm like, okay, I guess maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but it felt like this was a conversation they already had, and this was an issue that was already resolved. That was just like kind of my reaction in the moment. I was like, really, you're losing me here. But then thinking about what the reason she actually gives, of like, I felt like you weren't actually listening to me. Maybe what I was cluing into was not actually a conversation between them. It was like a conversation he had in his own head. I'd have to reread it to really go back and like follow that argument through line. But you know, it didn't lose me like in the whole story, but it was like a moment of like, it kind of like took me out of the story, because I was just like, this is the conflict and this is how you're gonna resolve it. Anyway, and again, like that could have just been like my own poor memory of devouring this thing in 2 days. Anyway, we're mostly here for these books for the sexy times, but I'm also here for like the emotional roller coaster, and it's great. And I've read book 2 and I need book 3 immediately. Those are the books. All right, if you have made it to the end of the video, can you leave me a cat emoji? If you've made it, you're a trooper. Okay. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have my social media and other places where you can find me in the description box below. And I will catch you folks in my next video. Bye!